Nintendo Switch emulation. Yes, everyone and their mother's already covered this topic, including High-Tech Lowlife. But one of the other major emulators, Ryujinx, actually got a major update. Vulcan is now in the mainline build of Ryujinx. Will this be enough to overtake Yuzu? Without further ado, let's begin then. This is our settings for Yuzu. Many of these settings are actually Emu Deck defaults. As you may have guessed, emulation isn't the most accurate per se, but you'll get playable frame rates. And now let's look at Ryujinx. And here are our settings for Ryujinx. As you can see here, we're not playing in docked mode at all. And as you can see here, our system is set to default. We haven't changed anything here. As for the graphics though, well, we're running at native resolution because there's no way to go down even further. So it may not be a fair fight per se. So this is Super Mario Odyssey, and honestly, the graphics don't look that bad despite the fact that we are basically running at half the resolution. I guess sometimes FSR can work miracles. Well, not quite, but you know. Yuzu runs pretty well in the first kingdom, but let's see what happens when we go to Cascade Kingdom. Things are a little more popping in Cascade Kingdom. In general, there's just a lot more going on. I mean, what do you expect, right? The frame rate's no longer a locked 60, but rather opting anywhere between low 50s and high 50s, with the occasional rise to 60. Obviously, this was done with the Yuzu version as mentioned in the video. So let's move over to Ryujinx and see how it handles Super Mario Odyssey. I gotta say, it seems like Ryujinx is running at 60 FPS at native resolution. Well, native for Nintendo Switch anyways. I guess it wasn't quite a fair fight given that Ryujinx has to generate its own shader caches, but honestly, the fact that it's keeping up with minimal stutters is pretty great, honestly. Ryujinx looks very promising. Now let's move over to Cascade Kingdom. Unfortunately, here, the game is a lot slower. There's a lot more going on. There's waterfalls everywhere. And so the game would dip anywhere between 40 to 50 FPS, with the occasional dip into the 30s. So I played around in this area, waiting for all the shader caches to potentially be, cached. And the frame rate did get better. If you look away from the main waterfall, you'll hit 60 FPS. But if you look directly at it, unfortunately, it stays at around like a 50 FPS. I'm not really sure how much more optimization can be done. Unfortunately, Ryujinx doesn't let you decrease the internal resolution of the game, so ultimately we're going to be playing at native resolution for every game. Ryujinx is also stated to apparently be a more accurate emulator, especially compared to Yuzu. If you value accuracy, Ryujinx is the way to go. So let's move on now. I think last time we showed off Pokemon Arceus, the game was nigh unplayable. The game is running a lot better than it was when we tried this out. As you can see here, the game is running at a pretty solid 30 FPS most of the time, with the occasional dip in case, there's like a shader being cached. It's also pretty impressive that it runs pretty close to 30 FPS when stuff is actually happening on screen. That said, the game will drop frames when more intense sequences are happening, and that happens on the actual Nintendo Switch hardware itself. So yeah, it's not exactly an emulator exclusive issue. And believe it or not, there is a 60 FPS mod, and the 60 FPS mod makes the game run a lot faster than it should, really. Ultimately, that's kind of the downfall with these 60 FPS mods, especially for games that aren't designed to go above like 30. Sometimes they'll tie game physics to the frame rate, and as such, when the frame rate drops or speeds up, it's gonna be really weird. You could run Pokemon Legends Arceus at 60 FPS if you really wanted to. It'll probably run at like 40 FPS still, but hey, that's technically better than the Nintendo Switch. Am I right, fellas? And this is Ryujinx running Pokemon Legends Arceus. As you can see here, it appears to be a solid 30 FPS, but the frame timing is just jumping all over the place. And with occasional dips too, into the 29s and 28s. Unfortunately, it seems like the game itself just runs worse overall. Worse than Yuzu, really. I mean, that's not that surprising. It's more of an accuracy-based emulator. And yes, Ryujinx also supports shader caches as well. That said, I'm not entirely convinced that it's all shader cache issues, because the game does hang around the 20 FPS area when you actually just run around, even after when shaders have been cached. Unfortunately, Yuzu also wins in performance here. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate on Yuzu. Let's see how this game runs. We actually haven't tested this out yet. And here we are, Steve versus Kazuya. The frame rate isn't a solid 60 FPS, especially not at the beginning of the match, which I would argue is the most important part of the match. The game definitely hits 60 FPS, it's just, it doesn't maintain the 60 FPS, not that well anyways. And for maximum zaniness, items are on. Aside from the very beginning though, there aren't too many frame dips afterwards. Also a note on shader caches. While shader caches won't dramatically tank your FPS, they will cause lag spikes. Unavoidable lag spikes too, especially if you experience something new in the game, which, given that you're playing Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, will happen quite often. You'll likely be playing this game for a long time before all the shaders have been cached. Every single move on every single stage, etc, etc. And every character's costume as well. On Ryujinx though, the frame rate for Super Smash Bros. Is worse in every way possible. The shader cache lag spikes are more egregious and more pronounced. I don't even think I've seen this match hit 60 FPS even once. Yeah, it's not necessarily a slam dunk for me, I'm sorry. Now, I would never recommend you play Breath of the Wild on Yuzu, or Ryujinx for that matter. Simi would be the best place to play Breath of the Wild, but we may as well throw it into the mix as well, because why not? The shader cache stuttering is very pronounced in this game, and this game is massive, so if you plan on playing this game on Yuzu the entire way through, don't be surprised if this is your entire experience. As you may have guessed, Ryujinx runs this game significantly worse. You want to see how badly this game runs? Well, just take a look. The game is so bad you can barely take a step before the game crashes. Yeah, the game crashes, by the way. Next up is Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and honestly we really wanted to test this game out. So it seems Xenoblade Chronicles 3 only really works in the early access version of Yuzu, which has no Linux binary, so we can't really record it here. And honestly, Ryujinx isn't really much better in this regard either. But at least the game boots up for a little bit, and then it just crashes. And honestly, I'm not really sure why. Am I missing something? Or perhaps we'll look into this a little more. Promise. Maybe for part 4, huh? So what did we learn today? Well, we learned that Nintendo Switch emulation is in a much better state than it was when we last checked it out, which was several months ago, I should add. But only on Yuzu, and only through finding more optimized options. Some might say we may have cheated by having Yuzu run at 0.5 times resolution, aka literally half the native resolution. We ultimately opted for a configuration that most people would be running, because that's actually EmuDeck's defaults. That said, Ryujinx put up a pretty decent fight despite the fact that we were running everything at native resolution. Could Ryujinx have taken the edge if we were able to drop the resolution to half the resolution, like we did with Yuzu? I think it might have, but I can't really be for certain until, you know, they do it. The big question though is whether or not they'll actually enable such a feature. Well, ultimately one can only hope that they'll implement such a feature in the future. If you like high-tech lowlife, you should subscribe and check out my other videos. In fact, if you like high-tech lowlife, you should check out my Discord server in the description down below. It's one heck of a good time and I know you'll like it.